Is spanking black children mimicking the master, the slave master, that is? Or is our lack of research and lack of study leading us to point a finger at someone who may have corrupted a practice but did not create a practice? Of someone who may have destroyed the dignity in a practice but did not establish the practice. This is session 1 of Reexamining the Rod, where we look at a conversation between Toure and Dr. Stacey Patton on the Toure Show and ask ourselves, is spanking children outdated? Is it archaic? Was it wrong from the beginning? Or do we just not understand its valuable place or the proper way to do it? Let's jump in.
Are we mimicking the master?
Yes, absolutely.
The slave master.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the brilliance of colonization, to convince you to think that this unnatural behavior is who you are, that it's intrinsic, that there's some benefit from doing this. So black people think, oh, I'm not in prison today because I got whooped.
So let's stop right here, because here is another brilliant trick of colonization. Another brilliant trick of colonization is this. They make you think that something that existed before them, which had dignity and order to it, once they corrupted it, they make you think that it was invented by them. So one of the errors that I think Dr. Stacey Patton makes here is that she looks at this idea of spanking and she only traces it back to the European society. And her belief and lack of research in that says that because spanking happens this way in European society must mean that they created this practice, which they put on the backs of us and our children in slavery, which now we have taken this practice and we have begun to do what the slave master has done to us. But there's a problem with that train of thought. Remember, what we're doing in this series is we're not comparing our opinion against Dr. Stacey Patton's opinion. We are asking the question, what does the scripture say about spanking versus what she says about spanking? Now, here's one boundary line that I need to draw. There is a huge difference between abuse and spanking. There is a huge difference between abuse and godly discipline. And most of my time in hearing her conversation, what I think she is talking about is abuse. But at the same time, however, we can have a conversation about abuse, but in having that conversation about abuse, we cannot be pendulum swingers and get rid of all physical discipline if God has directed it and if it is done in his love, in his care, in his righteousness and obedience. Let's continue.
Okay, so tell me why spanking is wrong. And remember that a lot of people are going to hear that and go, I got spanked and I turned out fine.
And I always say, think about how much better you could have been.
How much better could you have been? You'll never know who you would be if you hadn't gotten spanked.
Yes, exactly.
Or you can think about how much worse you would have been. See, right there is a half-sided false equivalency thought. Dr. Stacey and Toure make a false equivalent. They make a general statement that sounds like it's some kind of research conclusion, but they never factor in the other part of it. And actually, the scriptures tells us different, that those who do not get disciplined do not end up better. Now, let me speak on their behalf. They are not talking about ending all discipline. They just believe that spanking is not a form of good discipline. And they say to the people who say, man, spanking kept me away from this, spanking kept me away from that. And they say to them, think about how better you could have been. And I wonder if anybody else said to them, well, I want you to think about how worse I could have been. Which means that just because someone is spanked, it does not mean that they would have turned out better if they weren't. They could have turned out worse. Now, remember, we're not talking about abuse. Abuse is off the table. Abuse is wrong. Abuse is not in the Bible. Abuse is off of the table. But what I want to do is I do want to look at the scriptures really quickly. I want to look at Proverbs 23. Let's look at Proverbs 23 really quickly. And let's look at what the idea of godly discipline is. Let me blow that up for you so you can see that there. Proverbs 23, verses 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. Apply your heart to instruction and your ears to words of knowledge. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. So what we know about godly discipline already is that godly discipline does not condone abuse. Godly discipline does not condone hurting a child in a manner that is abusive. Godly discipline does not condone death of a child. Godly discipline is so controlled, it's so measured that the writer in the Psalms is giving a guarantee saying, listen, if you strike him with a rod, he will not die. Watch this. 14b, you will save his soul from Sheol, from hell. Now, we have some conflicting views here. Because Dr. Stacey Patton, if I could get her response from hearing her throughout this podcast, would say, well, this Bible and this God and how you've been indoctrinated through Christianity is the white man's fingerprint on your philosophy of discipline. And I would say to her, but Dr. Patton, do you not know that this Bible is not only the longest standing books, it was around before white people corrupted its use, not it, corrupted its use. But do you know before that, it has more of an African handprint on it than anything else? Do you know that you have to search high and wide, low and in the valley, to find a European person in this scripture? Do you know this book started in Africa? Do you know these ideas about discipline are in the Old Testament way before white supremacy? You will save his soul from Sheol. My son, if your heart is wise, my heart too will be glad. My inmost being will exalt when your lips speak what is right. They automatically say, if somebody gets spanked, I tell them to imagine how much better they could have been. But did you ever think how much worse they would have been, Dr. Patton? Let's finish it out.
Exactly. Would have never known.
More self-esteem,
more
maybe?
self-esteem, more intellectual capacity. You would have grown up to, if you really turned out fine, you would have grown up to.
Let's stop right there. More self-esteem, more intellectual capacity. Who is to say that discipline, when it is done correctly, does not give more self-esteem or more intellectual capacity? Let me give you an example. My daughter goes down to the corner store with friends, and her friends decide to steal, and she steals with them. And we found out that they steal because the store owner comes and contacts us, or the police show up and they have to contact us because she's a minor. And for stealing, we've talked about this multiple times, because one of the things that we have to notice in the scriptures, that spanking is always coupled with words of wisdom falling on rebellious ears. God only uses the rod, even with us, after he has spoken multiple times, and there is something that is coming in the way of us heeding and listening to his word. Then, at the end of that, he begins to pull the rod out on us. And so one of the principles we learn from the scriptures is that spanking should never be the first act or recourse for a child not being disciplined. That's one of the things that we do know, that spanking should never come first. There should become talking, there should become education. And here is what we can say. Even if you try to do it in a godly manner, we have to ask ourselves, if I spank without education, without information, without having healthy confrontation and conversation about it first, then am I in the parameters of abuse. Because God never disciplines us as his people without first having conversations with us, without first giving us chances to get it right over and over again. All right, so we've been talking about this, and she comes home and she gets a spanking because we're at that point where talking is falling on deaf ears about stealing or hanging out with the wrong crowd. Who's to say, if it's done in the right and a godly manner, that it doesn't build self-esteem into her and say, my dad spanked me, and when he did, he taught me that I am better than the decisions that I was making. And the reason why I make those decisions is because maybe I wanted to fit in with people who would not accept me as my better self, and I lowered my standards. Or maybe because I was operating in an intellectual capacity that was lower than my better self, and it's a false equivalent. You cannot say that spanking, outside of abuse, let's take abuse off the table. We cannot say that spanking in itself in a healthy and godly manner takes away from self-esteem or intellectual ability. It's totally a false premise. Let's finish out.
Look at that violence and say, this didn't feel good. You would have been able to tell the truth about it, that it didn't feel like love. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel protected. I felt fear. But that you grew up to normalize it and invert that kind of domestic violence as something that was healthy. And
let's stop right there. Here's another false equivalent or false accusation that has no premise. Presuppositions is what we call them. That love, safety, protection, and fear cannot exist within physical discipline. That if you physically discipline a person, you don't love them. That if you physically discipline a person, they're not safe. That if you physically discipline a person, they're not protected. And if you physically discipline a person, if they have fear, then that's a problem. Now remember, we're not going against Dr. Stacey Patton and our thoughts. This is not our thoughts, but I want to take you to another scripture. Instead of Proverbs 23, let's do Psalm 23. And when it is applied and when it is done the right way, verse 4, when it is done the right way, we see that love, safety, protection, and fear are all operating in a way that actually makes the person better and not worse. Here goes Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Y'all know that, right? Let's verse 4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod, which in this passage means your mark of authority, that you have authority over my life. And this rod is used as a mark of your authority at times to put me back on the path that you want me to walk and keep me away from a path that, if I go that way, will take me off course and put me in a dangerous place. Would I much rather deal, psalmist is dealing as a sheep, Would I much rather deal with a healthy physical discipline from my shepherd or a scenario with a wolf? Your rod and your staff. Rod meaning mark of authority. Staff meaning your provision for everything that I need. They comfort me. Notice the psalmist talks about rod and staff. Your rod and your staff. They comfort me. Psalms 23:4. That's a scenario, and we have many other scenarios in the scriptures where these things work together. Dr. Stacey Patton makes emotional presuppositions, but here's the compassion on it, and I understand why. Because Dr. Stacey Patton, in her own story, which we'll share as we get, a few sessions down, she wasn't disciplined the right way. She was abused. And she has the rightful position to stand there and say, I want no child to go through what I went through because I was abused. One of the things that we notice about spanking in the scriptures is the only allowable place that the scriptures talk about using the rod is on the backside. But Dr. Patton was hit with extension cords in her face. She has markings there that remind her every day. It's the reason why she wears hats, and we have compassion, and we feel that, and we say, Dr. Patton, what you were was abused, and that was wrong. And the same God that we believe will honor godly physical discipline also disapproves of what you went through. So what I think Dr. Stacey Patton and Toure are having a conversation about is abuse, which is either spanking done to harm in the wrong manner, taking out of context, done without education, information, confrontation, and healthy confrontation and conversation. All of those things need to come before we use the rod. But what we cannot do is swing the pendulum and begin to think that just because abuse is in our world, that ties our hands from dignified, godly, righteous, healthy physical discipline. Now watch this. Dr. Patton raises another point, and we're going to look at this. She actually calls spanking something, and this is going to be the topic of our next session.
Loving is a symptom, a sign that you actually didn't turn out fine.
She calls it domestic violence. Domestic violence. Watch this.
Something that was healthy and loving is that you grew up to normalize it and invert that kind of domestic violence as something that was healthy and loving is a symptom.
Our next question on our next segment of Reexamining the Rod is spanking domestic violence? We want to talk about that. Is spanking domestic violence? We'll see you next time.